So, welcome now finally in person in this next lecture on embodied neurodynamics. I'm happy to entertain questions anytime. So if you want to ask a question, just open your mic. In the presentation mode, I can't really see you. So just open your mic and speak, and I'll try to react. So the video you just saw looked at these DFT models when they are models of behavior, and they were models of behavior in the sense that there was an interface between the model and the world. Two ends, the conditions in the world that would be relevant for behavior or an experiment was mapped onto a set of inputs to the model. I think you should be seeing my cursor now. And on the other hand, the neural state in the model was mapped onto a particular behavior the model was supposed to explain in the world. And so what we want to do now is to push this to a level where we make that real, in the sense that we really link the DFT models to actual sensors and to actual motor systems. And I'll start by talking about how we link to sensors. And I'll do this here in terms of looking at a vehicle. This is a robotic, a robotic vehicle. This is sort of a pedagogical device to do that, just like I referred earlier to Breitenberg vehicles. And I'll later point out how to generalize from that. This is a vehicle we actually built. You look at it, looks very simple. We built that when I worked in Marseille. Pierre Mallet, who was a co-author here, built it, an engineer, using toy parts. It was about 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter. Had a computer inside. Estela Bichou, who's a co-author here and whose work I will be referring to extensively, did her PhD thesis with me on that in Marseille at the time. And she's actually now heading a lab in Portugal at the University of Minho, Guimarães, with her husband, Wolfram Elhagen, whom you know because I just referred extensively to his work. And the two of them actually are a major group using the sorts of ideas I'm talking about in robotics. They do that in human-robotic interaction, cooperative robotics, and actually in actual real industrial applications. So much more advanced now than these very simple robots we had at the time. So this robot vehicle, I'll talk about its motor control later. It has two active wheels, so it's very well described by just it can rotate on the spot by heading direction. I'll come to that. It has sensors for distance sensing, which I will be referring to a little later. Here, these little buds, they are infrared detectors. There's a little infrared emitter, and these detectors then find how much light is reflected from a surface, and that is a rough measure of distance, so it's very crude. There's also sonars on those, but we didn't use those for the projects I'll talk about. And the other sensors that I'll be talking about first now are these microphones. There are 5 microphones here, and those will be the sensors that we'll use to talk about how a field is driven by input. And so it's a very simple picture in which each of these microphones points into a particular direction on the robot, and we'll talk about the direction in the world that contributes to. I'll elaborate that a little later. Each microphone has some kind of sensitivity cone, crudely assessed by us. These are relatively simple, cheap microphones that are not very unidirectional, omnidirectional. That cone was about plus minus 30 degrees, and we modeled that cone as a Gaussian with the width being that 30 degrees. So we have only 5 sensory measures. These are the 5 loudness levels from the 5 microphones. And each is considered to contribute this sort of sensitivity cone, which you could think of as a tuning curve to the field that we'll be feeding these into. So we'll have a field defined over heading direction, and it receives just these 5 inputs. That is the 5 numbers from the microphones, multiplying each of these receptive fields, providing then input to the field. So for instance, if you have 2 sound sources as indicated here, then depending on the level of sound coming from those, for instance, these 2 microphones might be driven much more than these, and the sum of these inputs goes into the field, and the notion would be that the field then generates, for instance, a single peak located over the local maximum of the inputs, and that will be the estimate of the direction of the sound source. And here is a actual example on the robot. This is the robot not moving, and its motors disconnected, and it's just standing there. So the heading right now is the heading also relative to the robot. And we had really literally a loudspeaker out there through which we played some music. It was actually Vivaldi, a very nice high pitch. So these cheap microphones get nice drive from those. And what we did here, so this is a heading, and this is the location at which this loudspeaker was positioned. And all we did is tune up the volume on the loudspeaker. We just did that by hand, you know, turning the knob. And as we did that, input arose at some point to the environment. See, there's some noise in the environment. It fluctuates because of the music and because of this, the room is not perfectly silent. And you see the activation field into which these 5 numbers, you know, folded through the tuning curves provide input. This is the field here. That makes a detection decision right here when the input is sufficiently large, builds a peak, suppresses activation anywhere else, and so that would be the estimate of the location of the sound source. So it does 2 things. It detects the sound source at a critical level of sound level, and it estimates its position. So that's the first instance of seeing one of those instabilities in real life, in a real sensory input, in response to a real sensory input. The field, as we just saw again, it can make detection decisions. So we put 2 loudspeakers here in front of that system and get bimodal input from these 5 numbers. And as you see, the field in this case selected the rightmost source and suppressed input at the leftmost source. And you literally see here the fluctuations I referred to earlier, where just reading out the local maximum would not be a stable way to make decisions, and the field stabilizes the decisions. We actually really found, I'll refer to that back later in this talk, that we used this robot to implement the A not B model, and I'll end this vehicle section on that. And when we first did that, we did it with this robot first, just as a pedagogical device for the psychology researchers who were interested in that. We actually, in a sense, forgot to do it that way. We just had an ad hoc algorithm reading out the maximum, and then we really found that the robot does randomly switch between the 2 targets and was therefore meandering around in a way that isn't consistent with the model behavior. So it's really a critical property to make that selection decision stable when you're a robot. That's actually also very useful for what engineers call robust estimation. So what you see here is the intensity profile passed through the receptive fields or tuning curves when a cardboard was simply on one side of that loudspeaker, and that led to echo. And so here this is a little bit sound coming from these other directions because of that cardboard. That's the problem with sound, really, that is not very good about localization. So if you just take an average, like a theoretical mean or some typical estimator, then you will get an estimate that's biased here in the direction of that echo, while it might be a much better estimate to look at the local maximum. And that's what the field does. It positions the peak on the local maximum and discards these outliers. That's something that is actually very useful in engineering terms. That's sort of an aspect of selection, of decision making. It's all dynamic, right? The peak is coupled to input. We say it makes this decision that there's input, but then keeps being coupled. So if you move the input, the peak tracks that input. That's one of the aspects where it's important that you have a tractor solution, stable states. There's a little time delay in bringing about that tracking, but that's tolerable. Just like any control system, there's some delay. So this came about just by moving the loudspeaker across the array by hand. We just moved it across the array, very down to earth. Finally, the robot also had memory, working memory. So here you see when the loudspeaker is on for a moment, but then we turn it back off. Then you see that the field generates a peak while the output is on. And then it actually keeps having that sustained activation. So this little part, that's the sustained activation the field has. In this robot demonstration, we actually turned off the working memory when we detected that there was a peak but no input. We started a process that lowers the resting level of the field, and as I hinted in the video that you just saw, that will ultimately push the system out of that range of having working memory, just like the young infants. And then we had a recovery process. So that was a demonstration of functions. In a vehicle like that, you don't want to have working memory to persist for too long, because as you drive around, the bearing of the target changes. And so after some time, any working memory that you have of the direction in which the target lies becomes invalid. So we showed how you could sort of forget about that. But that's not so important for the psychological models that we'll be using most of the time. So here's a demonstration. I think you can hear the sound as well. I'm not quite sure if it actually goes through. So sound is coming out of this room here. Initially, the robot actually detects the echo, locks onto the echo that comes from the wall. But because the echo is not persistent over time, then at some point it does switch to the sound source that is in here, and will then be going to that sound source. And I'll come back to this example later. So in this example, you're using detection to decide that there's sound. You're using selection to narrow in on the persistent sound source. And there's working memory because which is important to deal with the intermittent structure of that sound. We originally had the notion that the human would be calling the robot and would be following the robot. It becomes very tiresome to do that when in an experiment. And of course, the robot wouldn't know what you're saying, would just go for the sound. And that is a demonstration that one can actually make. So this very simple story sort of illustrates that linking sensory input to DFT architectures as such is sort of straightforward, right? It's this concept of forward connectivity that forward neural networks provide, and one can do a lot more than in this trivial example. For instance, really extract features through forward neural networks, and so one can actually leverage that whole area of how to do that. And there will be a talk later in the school, for instance, by Raul Grieben, who will show you some more typical feature extraction in the visual domain, like extracting orientation, things like that. The only sort of known issue is partly addressed by neural networks like that. The best understood problem is the normalization problem. And that's also really the only really practical problem that you might have. So for instance, if you have sound sources of very different volume, or echo in the room or things like that, then you might have to tune the parameters, because inputs that are very weak in one setting would then become very strong and overwhelm the field, make very, very broad, large peaks, and that are no longer interaction dominate in another setting. The human nervous system and animal nervous systems are extremely good at dealing with this problem. You're perhaps familiar with that. For instance, if you're in a room with a window, then there are between 5 and 6 orders of magnitude difference in luminance between the window where you get the light from the sky and some dark corner on your desk. And you're still able to simultaneously see visual structure outside the window. I have a light window right now here. I see the trees out there, and I can still see objects in the shadow. And there are many orders of magnitude, up to 6 orders of magnitude in a difference in luminance. And you might have noticed that digital cameras don't do that very well. If you have a digital camera, it adjusts the overall shutter to create some contrast. But if you have a bright window inside, then you will often see that everything else is very dark. And we understand very well how even retinal circuitry, which is not purely feed-forward, it has recurrent loops, the retinal ganglion cells do that, how they normalize contrast locally. So, and there's a lot of work on that in computational neuroscience and neuroscience. And so what I'm hinting at is that that sort of know-how can be and should be leveraged, and many of our models don't really do that, and that's really just a question because of us not, being able to do everything. But it should really be done, and it should be really an integration of feed-forward, and not purely feed-forward. I mean, conceptually feed-forward networks that have some recurrency to fine-tune to actually deal exactly with these kind of normalization problems. So that's the only issue on the sensory end, and it can be a real issue of hard work to be done to do this right, but no novel innovation is required at that end. Again, I'm referring to the other talks who will have aspects of that, and these four talks by Raul, Mathis, Daniel, and Jan will all actually link their models to actual inputs, to sensory camera inputs. Now, it's quite different at the motor end. So creating a link to a motor system, this robot was actually moving, right? And how that happens is a much more challenging issue. It essentially entails the entire issue of how you generate motor behavior. Remember in the introductory lecture, I pointed out that in motor systems, the physical state of the actuator and of the body matters, and therefore you have a dynamical system there where there are dynamic properties of that physical system that matter. So I'll spend now some time on that aspect, on how motor behavior can be generated, and on what we call behavioral dynamics, that is on how the motor interface is a dynamical system that has physical state variables as variables. So that will be some new territory that will have to be treading, and I'll refer back to what I did in the introductory lecture, cybernetic kind of thinking, and expanding that. And then we'll talk about how the fields interface with that. So generally, when you talk about motor behavior, you're talking about state variables that describe whatever part of the body, actuator, effector, or so you're talking about. I'll be talking about this vehicle now. And for that, we call these variables that characterize the state behavioral variables. And behavioral variables means that there are variables, the values of which, or time courses of which, correspond to particular movement behaviors. And this correspond to means that the physical control system, for instance, the muscles or the whatever the actuator is wired up to these variables such that then physically the behavior comes about. And you'll see that very concretely in a moment. And the key idea of that lower level is to say that these time courses of the behavioral variables are generated from attractors of a dynamical system, just like I pointed out in the introduction that the Breitenberg vehicle actually orients to the target because there is an attractor there for that variable heading direction. In fact, we'll be talking exactly about that variable for the vehicle. It will be the heading direction is the velocity, the orientation, the angle of the velocity vector, the orientation aspect of the velocity vector. So a vehicle moving in a plane, this kind of vehicle with active wheels has 2 degrees of freedom. It can move forward and it can rotate on the spot. And normally it combines these two things. On a robot like that, that's just controlled by the 2 wheels. If the 2 wheels, if you look at the average rotation of the 2 wheels, that determines the speed, the forward velocity, and the difference in rotation of the 2 wheels determines the rotation rate of the vehicle. If you think of a car, a four-wheel vehicle, it's a bit more complicated because the steering angle and this is more complicated geometry, but it's roughly the same idea. So we talk about the heading direction as something that is measured against a axis that is anchored in the world, some world axis. It's easy to think of that. If you think of a ship in the Navy, then you have a compass and you're actually talking about your heading relative to that compass. Like you say, I'm heading 20 degrees, from north. That's a good metaphor for what we'll be doing. I'll be using jargon like that. I personally actually was in the Navy, so I'm very much prone to do that. But in these robotic examples, it will not be necessary to calibrate that world axis to really anchor it in sensory information. We don't need a compass. It will turn out then in a lot of cases, we don't actually need to exactly know that. It's just that the variable is conceptually defined that way. And I'll come back to that several times because that is connected to an important issue that I'll call invariance. We'll look at that. So for the moment, just think of it, you can always mentally think of it in relative to north, without a need to be exactly oriented. Okay, so that's that, and so that variable is able to express now constraints on the behavior, which are really behavioral goals. The most important one we'll be interested in now is to motivate the vehicle, or to arrange for the vehicle to go in a particular direction toward a target. And that constraint can be expressed as the angle psi under which we see that target, under which relative to that fixed world axis. So in the Navy, again, if you think about a certain target and say it's 30 degrees from north, then you know that is the angle I want to steer. That is, you're moving toward that target if your current heading is equal to that specified heading. Phi equals psi. The other kind of constraint we want to add is obstacles. And I do that for conceptual reasons. It will be useful to talk about that. So obstacle avoidance could be framed as a particular direction in the world that you don't want to move into. So the angle psi ops would be the bearing of the obstacle relative to that axis, and you would say, this is an angle I want to avoid. Maybe there's a whole range of angles I want to avoid if that obstacle has a certain size. You can think about that more detailed, that you might have to have an extra margin on the left and right you want to avoid. We generically will assume that the influence of that constraint is stronger if the obstacle is closer to you. So you don't want to avoid an obstacle that's very far. If you did that, then you would always be constrained, even if because ultimately somewhere there will be an obstacle if you move far enough. So we're really talking about obstacles that are close, and the influence of obstacle avoidance will be scaled with distance. And we will look at how you sense distance for that. Now, to erect these two types of behaviors, or to make sure that these constraints are fulfilled, we'll use behavioral dynamics. And the behavioral dynamics means we're looking at a dynamical system where the rate of change of heading is a function of heading, right? That's how I introduced the notion of dynamics earlier. And so when that's a well-defined function, then for any initial heading that you have, you generate a new value of heading by looking at its rate of change and integrating that over time. And so the idea is, on the robot concretely, of course, we just solve that equation on the robot, and then we give the new heading to the wheels, and the wheels turn. Actually, on the robot, it turns out you only need this. You only need the rate of change, because you can impose a particular rate of change on the two motors, the difference between the rotation rate of the two motors, and you don't even need to compute the heading that resides. If you think about animals and so on, the Breitenberg example gave you a little bit of an idea how that could be implemented. I'll talk again at the end about muscles and how to actually do that biologically. So the idea would be that we erect this dynamics, we define it. So we built it, in our mathematical model in a way that it has an attractor at the desired heading, the heading toward the target. So zero crossing negative slope at that heading, that would mean that anywhere else we start, we will be attracted to the heading toward the target. This is a nonlinear function really just because angle is it's an angular variable, the heading, and therefore it needs to have a periodic function. So we typically take a sinus or cosinus function, and that is a nonlinear function. In fact, it really has a repeller at the opposite direction. So if you're exactly moving away from the target, then you have to decide whether you go around toward the target on the left or on the right, and that would be a repeller. So that is just a property of angular variables like heading. Obstacle avoidance can be construed as just the opposite, making a repeller at the direction of the obstacle. So if you're a little bit to the right, you have a positive rate of change, you're further increasing your heading. If you're a little bit to the left, negative rate of change on decreasing your heading. So that's how you will be avoiding the direction of the obstacle. Again, you make this whole contribution to the dynamics larger if the obstacle is closer, and larger will mean this slope is very steep. When the obstacle is close, it will be very flat, going to 0 if the obstacle is sufficiently far. When students implement that in our robotics lab, they are sometimes say, well, why do we have very small rate of change, turning rate, when we're heading right to the obstacle? And you could think, if I'm heading right to the obstacle, and, you know, I'm exactly on that heading, I have 0 rate of change. You know, that's terrible. I'm going to collide. And it's true, you will need a little bit of a perturbation, maybe noise, sensor uncertainty, or imperfect steering to escape from this repeller. Once you're a little off, you know, you will be moving fast, rotating fast. So students think, oh, well, maybe I should do something different. Should have a radical, like a cut here, make a jump. It would have a radical steering to the right or radical steering to the left. That would be better. Well, it turns out this was not better, and that routinely creates a lot of problems when you do it that way. And the reason for that is perhaps intuitive. Let's say if you had a step function here, so you radically steer to the left or the right, and you switch that exactly at the obstacle, then any sensory uncertainty you have about where exactly that step function is could move the step function through your current heading, and as a result, your dynamics would become very unstable. So it's actually always a bad idea to violate the principle of dynamics, that those principles require continuous dynamical functions, and so the repeller picture is really the right picture. This is not purely academic, because you will see in a moment that in the over the course of behavior, the dynamics does go through instabilities, through bifurcations, which turn a attractor into a repeller, and then you actually are exactly at the repeller, and now you have to escape from it. That's where this becomes relevant, and that's where we sometimes add noise, because the sensor noise isn't totally reliable. Sometimes you can have very little sensor noise. Okay, so here is an illustration of how multiple constraints like that are combined. And here I'm starting with a simple example where I have a target influence, I have 2 obstacle influences, and they are not in conflict. That is, you can move through here without problem, and we've arranged for the corresponding dynamic contributions to not be in conflict. Here, the pink curve, or what that is, or magenta, has a attractor here corresponding to this direction, and then these 2 sort of orange type curves have repellers, one here, and there's another curve there. You are seeing my cursor now, right? So much better, I hope. So you see that the 2 repellers in the attractor of the individual contributions are also repellers and attractors of this black curve, which is the sum over these 3 contributions. The sum has also extra attractors here on the outside. These are essentially the outside of the repulsion term. When the repulsion peters off, it's sort of like a semi-attractor, right? You're pushed off here. You're not stabilized against moving even further away. But the target term, which is very broad, makes this half attractor into a real attractor. So there's a real attractor here and there, and that corresponds to the vehicle going around the whole ensemble of the obstacles on the left, on the right, or on the left, right? So you have 3 ways. You have to go around the whole configuration on the left, a whole configuration on the right, or go right through it. And that's these 3 attractors that you have in this dynamics. So that's without any violation of the constraints. If you move these 2 obstacles in, now they start to violate each other. Now, if you move in there, you would have collision. And so what we have arranged in parametrizing these functions is that this is when a bifurcation occurs. I'll look at that in a moment. So now when these 2 obstacle contributions are pushed toward each other, they overlap so much that they build a rather steep sum here, the black line, that is steeper than the red line. And so it's re-engineered by the obstacles contribution being stronger than the target contribution, and that arises when the obstacles are close, as here. So you could collide with them. while the attractions on the outside still exist, now they come in handy because now that's the only option left. You're going to go around the whole configuration. So when you push the obstacles in, so like it's just a mental operation of different parametrically described environments that this robot might encounter, could also happen in time. And the system goes through a bifurcation. It's this bifurcation here where if you're decreasing the distance, so here in the opposite direction, decreasing the distance between the obstacles, the two repellers you had earlier with an attractor in the middle that will be passing through between these obstacles, they all collide and become a single repeller. This is called a pitchfork bifurcation, obvious name. It happens only if it's exactly symmetrical, if the obstacle on the left and on the right have the same weight. More generically, would have a tangent bifurcation where the red line collides with the green line and the other red line just goes through, but would have the same functional meaning. And that bifurcation makes that change, this decision to change behavior. So if you're sitting in the middle, at this point, you're going to change behavior and to go to either this or that, depending on noise, and go around the obstacle configuration as a whole. The attractions outside don't suffer any instability, they just go through. So if you're sitting in that from the start, you don't even notice that there was that bifurcation. So in behavioral dynamics, just like I did that, explained that in neurodynamics, bifurcations are connected to decisions. And it's very much the same idea here. So here's a demonstration of that on the robot. The robot has a target here. This is a little cross. It knows the target only by dead reckoning. So integrating its motor commands. Doesn't have a map of the world. So it's repelled here from these card boxes, but it doesn't know if there's an opening here. So it's just by chance it was trying to steer back that it finds that opening. The sensors, these infrared sensors, are somewhat short-sighted. They have about 20 centimeter range, 25. That's why the robot, doesn't turn earlier. It's only now it starts to get some repulsion, turns the other way. It doesn't know that there's a shortcut there. Actually, Pierre Mallet acts as an obstacle here to avoid that it takes very long for the robot to get out of this, because it's a purely local approach. So this little opening wasn't sufficient, and the robot still avoids this wall, and I'll accelerate that a little bit. And so here, now we opened it enough, and it's going through. The keyboard actually is just here put on top. So it almost touches here. It's not supposed to. It's not part of its body scheme. So what you do when you do this experimentally, so this just restarts, is that you arrange for the parameters, but you calibrate the parameters so that this transition between going through and not going through on this previous trial, that transition occurs exactly at the when the opening is large enough for the robot to pass through, and there's some possibility to do that analytically. That's interesting to roboticists, not so much to us in biology. So I talked as if the obstacles were objects, right? I was saying here, there's an obstacle here and there, and I was saying we're taking, for every obstacle, we're taking here, an obstacle makes a contribution like that. But we don't actually need to do that. That would be not so easy to, for instance, if you have that, to say which objects are the obstacles. We don't need to do that, because all we want to say is if there is something close, we want to not go in that direction. We don't care if it's one object or two objects or whatever. So the approach that was actually realized here is an approach in which sensory information is very directly coupled into the behavioral dynamics. So what we do is that every sensor on that vehicle essentially votes for an obstacle in the direction in which it is pointing in the world, the psi-ops, and the vote, the force that it contributes is the stronger, the shorter the measured distance. That means there is something in the sector of that sensor that is sufficiently close to cause concern. And so in practice, we know the range over which these sensors are sensitive, because they have a certain cone, again, these infrared sensors, and we arrange for the repulsive force disk to have the right width to cover that range, so that we would avoid that whole angular sector. So when you do that, this is an example of that. Here's the robot, here's an obstacle. This is actually real numbers we took from a measurement on the robot. It's heading in this direction. So under these conditions, the sensor number 5 and number 6 sends a distance that is not infinite. For this robot, more than 30 centimeters is infinite, always. And so you see the only two forcelet contributions come from these two sensors that erect a repeller sort of in the middle between those two, which would be pretty much vertical here, would be pointing in this direction. That's where the repeller lies. So that makes sense. Now you might have to worry about whether this actually works, because if the robot rotates, then the sensors are going to look into different directions in the world, and therefore the repulsive forcelets that they add would also rotate. And you could wonder if that actually really gives you a consistent dynamics, because the dynamics is supposed to tell us at which heading direction we have which turning rate. So if I measure the dynamics, measure the distances at the red position, which is where the robot currently is, I'm predicting that when the robot has turned to this orientation, it has this turning rate according to this black curve. That's the superposition, right? But when I'm actually rotating the vehicle to that blue position, different sensors point now toward the obstacle. So you see it's actually now 3 sensors, number 3, 4, and 5, 2, 3, and 4, that have contributions, and it's different size because the distances measured are different. And so you have to worry whether the dynamics actually will be consistent with the dynamics that we originally estimated in that situation. If it isn't, then the dynamics doesn't actually predict the rate of change as a function of heading, and it isn't a consistent dynamic, so the robot will not behave consistently. It turns out, as you see here from the superposition, that the dynamics is the same. It is invariant under rotation of the vehicle, even though the sensor information is not invariant, right? Here you have 2 numbers from 2 sensors, 3 numbers from 3 other sensors. So that's variant sensor information leading to invariant dynamics. That's an important issue that goes through all closed-loop sensory motor implementations. And you will see that also later in the course when we talk about coordinate transforms. It's always about creating this form of invariance that makes it possible to have persistent dynamics. So it's fine to just consider each sensor a repeller. It's only true if the parameters are chosen adequately to represent correctly the physics of sensing here. So we had to make the width and distance dependent of these forcelets right to get that invariance. In fact, that's one of the criteria that you have in your parameter tuning. In this model, in this work, we only did that by hand, by sort of playing around with it. It wasn't very difficult. Engineers would optimize that, and one can certainly do that. Okay, so I'll be coming back to this issue of invariance, and we'll see this, for instance, even for target acquisition in a little while under the label of coordinate transform. Wanted to say generally, this is a use of sensory information that is in a way unsegmented. That is, we're just getting a vector of distances. In this case, it's 7 sensors, so 7-dimensional vector, and we're erecting these forces from that. And it is the dynamics that then decides where there are repellers in this case. So we're not actually segmenting and saying there is an object here that is the obstacle or 2 obstacles and so on. And that is characteristic of a whole set of approaches. For instance, vehicles, autonomous vehicles work sort of like that. That is, they don't have to make a perception analysis into objects to drive. They can take a laser rangefinder depth map and just steer in the direction of this distance, for instance, and for that they don't need to know what objects are out there. Maybe sometimes it might be useful for other purposes, but not as such. And that's one of the reasons I hinted at earlier why the vehicle metaphor is simpler, why the demands on perception are lower. And I want to come back to this issue in what is likely to be tomorrow when I talk about reaching, where that is no longer true. Now let's look at target acquisition. So in target acquisition, we are now really requiring that you select an object, that you talk about a sound source as an object. And of course, we're thinking about the sound source being represented by the peak in that field. And the field makes that attentional selection of an object, differentiating between echo and object. And so that's something that we want to now face. It is actually possible sometimes to also go toward targets without that commitment to objects. For instance, you could say in navigation, you just want to move to a place where you have again the same view that you had earlier without in that view identifying objects. That is actually the framework in which people think about hippocampal place cells functioning. They don't need to refer to particular objects in the environment. So it's not always necessary, but a lot of actions that we as humans do are actually oriented at objects, and there we are confronted with this interface between perception and motor. So when we have a peak that represents, in this vehicle example, represents the direction in the world in which the target lies, we now need to create a behavioral dynamics that makes that a target by erecting an attractor. So having a rate of change of heading as a function of that same variable that has its zero crossing at where the peak is with a negative slope. That will be our goal. And I want to discuss now two conceptual issues that arise in this interface between population code peak and motor behavior. One I call the readout problem, and the other is actually, again, an invariance problem. So the readout problem is a very general problem that occurs in a lot of neural networks as well. It's so I'm framing it here a bit more generally. It's this idea that if you have a neural population that represents something, so for instance here intuitively you would say the population with a peak over some dimension represents the peak position, in the sense that if you do some kind of average or you do a winner take all, this is the value along the dimension that is the best estimate of what that is about. So how do you compute that? And of course the usual idea would be that there is some neural network to a motor layer where every neuron here in this along the field would vote for its value for whatever it represents, and then the system on which it converges would then do the right thing. And what I'm pointing at is that requires, again, some normalization. It's different in nature from the sensory normalization, but it's the same theoretical problem. And a good way to understand that is to think of this as reading out a probability density. So if the positive activation, we're always thinking about the sigmoided activation, so this positive peak here, if you think of that as a probability density over this dimension, then you would compute the theoretical mean. Theoretical mean would be, this is the sigmoided activity as a function of this dimension x, multiplied with x, summed or integrated over all x, but I have to normalize that. That is, oh, here's a parenthesis missing. I have to divide by, and it's missing here too, sorry, divide by all activity in the field, suprathreshold activity. That would be the theoretical mean. And when you say each neuron votes for its value, that the center of its receptive field x with its current activation, that will be this part, but it has to be normalized. You can see that it has to be normalized if the peak was just blown up, if it was much larger, right? You put that into only this top part, this would mean this here is much larger. That would mean you get a larger number out of it. That is, if the peak is the same shape but blown up, the specified value would move to the right. So it would have bias, right? And have a very small amplitude, this number becomes small, then the peak position would be shifted to the left. That's a bias problem. So it only works if you normalize correctly. And normalization is a problem. It's a problem conceptually because we are exactly interested in cases where there is either a peak or no peak. That's the detection instability. If we have not detected a target, we want to still be able to run this system. And so the neural field is supposed to not then have infinite give some infinite response. So that's a well-known problem, and a lot of work in computational neuroscience sort of deals with that problem. There's something called divisive normalization to deal with it. And it turns out that if you think about it deeply, it goes away when you think about the behavior being really a dynamical system or generated by a dynamical system, rather than being something that reads a value. It's only us as scientists that read something, but the body always actually ultimately does something dynamic, ultimately with reflex loops. And I'll explain that now in 2 or 3 slides. So this idea of saying I only need a dynamic system is amounts to this that I already hinted at, that if I have a field, that what I actually want is that there where the peak is, I'll erect an attractor for some behavioral dynamics, some x, as a rate of change of x over x. And at the right value of x, I want to have a dynamic with a negative slope that makes an attractor there. And in general, this doesn't have to be exactly the same dimension as that. So there could be some non-trivial mapping from one space to the other. But the end effect of that will be that in this space, the behavioral variable space, there would be that attractor. For the examples, I always now assume it's the same dimension. And in the robot, it's concretely in heading direction. So for the normalization issue, the important idea is that when there is no peak, like here, it's flat, what we want is flat dynamics, so 0 contribution to the dynamics. That's appropriate because that would mean that every value of x is marginally stable. So if you previously had some value of x, you're just going to stay there, might be drifting due to noise. That's correct because usually you would have multiple contribution to the behavioral dynamics, right? In our case, you would have, for instance, the obstacle contribution. So if you don't have a target, you still want to avoid obstacles. And you might be willing to wander around freely, as we sometimes really have in our robots, and just avoid obstacles. That's going to be fine. And for that, this is the correct behavior because now these obstacle forcelets you would be adding to are not distorted at all by the contribution from the target field, as they should not, because there is no target. Right? So what we're positing is with a peak, we have this attractor. Without a peak, we have a flat dynamics. And this is how you could do that. So if you had the peak position, I call that phi naught now. So that would be this position where the peak lies. If you had computed that in this way, there's also a parenthesis missing here, then this would be a good linear dynamical system. So it would have the negative slope with a minus alpha, and phi minus phi naught would mean that the 0 crossing is at phi equals this phi naught. Now the trick is to say, I can achieve that this becomes flat when there is no peak by making this alpha proportional to the total activity in the peak. Again, another parenthesis missing. Sorry, I do that systematically, it seems. So when there's no suprathreshold activity, alpha returns 0, the slope is flat. There could be some other coefficient here in front, doesn't have to be exactly the integral. So this would be right. And I'll be showing you now on the next slide with a couple of equations that when you do it this way, the division by 0 problem goes away. This is here a couple of equations. So just have this term here that I was talking about, and I insert first this expression for alpha. So that's what I'm doing here, right? I just inserted that. And then in the second step, I'm inserting this expression here for the phi naught. I'm using different variables here because there are these multiple integrals. So this is the integration variable for that, and this is the integration variable for that, just to make that, because those are, I could have used yet another variable here. And so you see two things. You see the first, this phi is the phi here from the outside. So you can write that under this integral. It doesn't change anything. The second term, this is the same integral as that. So they cancel. Here you see it cancels, right? And so this integral remains. And the only difference between this integral and that first integral is that here it's the integration variable that is under the integral. And here, this is one is the external one. So I put this together as a expression here, phi minus phi prime, and then I have the solution. So it's no more division by 0. And you can now actually see the logic of this, what happens here is that if you interpret this again neurally, that every location phi prime in the field votes not for its value, but for a whole dynamics, because minus this expression, that is a linear dynamics for phi with zero crossing at phi prime with a negative slope, right? Negative slope. So every location votes for a little attractor at its location, and the weight of that attractor, the slope of the dynamics, is proportional to the activation at that location. That's really the readout. It's voting for an attractor rather than voting for a value. Then you don't have a division by zero problem, and that's how it's implemented on many of our systems. And later I'll show you that reflexes can be sort of modeled that way. Now, in practice, we don't always use this linear term. Sometimes we use a force that limit the range of the contribution as well. And that's a way how we can shape the resulting dynamics a bit better. So that's what was implemented on that other system. Before I show you how all of this works, I have to talk about the second problem. And that's a problem I kind of swept under the rug so far. I argued that we need this world coordinate to integrate these different contributions. That's where the dynamics is invariant. But I also wrote this down here as if it was over world coordinates, and this works well. But if you think about the sensors, they are mounted on the robot, like these microphones are mounted on the robot. So when you rotate the robot, they rotate with the robot, right? I call this your retinal because they're connected to some retinal reference frame. And so actually you might have wondered earlier about how come I can make a peak in the world frame while really the peak should be in some body frame, centered on the robot. That would be like a retinal frame if it was vision. And so we actually arranged for the retinal or body frame information to be transformed into the world frame on the robot, frankly, just by through an algorithm, by estimating the heading direction of the robot. We kept estimating that, and then shifting the input to a location in the world frame, the heading direction frame, that was approximately right. Why would we do that? Well, really because again the field, the peak that represents the target, has to be in an invariant frame, a frame that is independent under how you acquire the sensor information. It's maybe most evident when you think about memory. So if you want to store where in which direction the sound source lay while it is off, it would make no sense to store that in a body frame because you're trying to steer to that sound source. So as you're turning to it, if it moves with your body, then you would keep rotating on the spot, right? It would be like the donkey and the carrot, which maybe works because the donkey is an actual animal and has other ideas, but it certainly doesn't work as a dynamical system. The Germans among you will know the story of Lukas the Lokomotivführer, where they use a magnet to pull along a locomotive, and the magnet is connected to the locomotive. And of course, that doesn't work. It's a perpetuum mobile. And so that's not a consistent dynamical system. So we really have to express this in world coordinates. And so again, the criterion is to have that invariance under sensor information. And that's a very general principle. If you go up to much higher levels of perception, it's always about that, about making the perceptual representation invariant under the different ways you might experience sensorially the evidence for that kind of object. So in the robot that I just showed you, it's just an algorithm in there that keeps integrating the heading direction that you generate. Only for that purpose, we actually need the heading direction, and uses that to then just shift the input distribution to the right locations in the world. And in my lecture tomorrow on high dimensional fields, I'll show you how that's actually neurally done, what the neural mechanism behind that is. This is where you maybe also see why you don't need to calibrate the world frame. The important thing is really just that this is invariant, so that it doesn't change too much. It might drift even, because your estimate of where you're headed might over time get to be a little bit off, because there's some noise in your sensors, or your motors don't follow the command very well. But that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if you think how many degrees this is. It just matters that it is always at the same location. Any error here will cancel on the readout. It's just not allowed to drift too fast, because then you would really notice that change. So you don't have to calibrate this axis. Good. So that's how this works. So this is the same robot. So now you know how the motor part of it works. It again, I wonder if you even hear the music. I'm not sure. A video I play, maybe you hear it, right? Anybody? Yeah. And so ultimately, this robot also does obstacle avoidance. For instance, you see that it goes here through the door, and then there is some cardboards and so on. So it does obstacle avoidance. And we arranged for this to, the speed is also a function of the sound intensity, and it stops when it's in front of the robot. That's just a robotic demonstration. Okay. So this was just a pedagogic example to explain the issues. I wanted to take you through this example, the A not B experiment, which we built on a robot, and to make some points about that. And this is sort of a project that we began with Esther Thiel, and I hinted at that earlier, that she learned about our robotics work and was very interested in that as a psychologist. And we actually brought this robot that I just showed you from Marseille to Indiana, and it broke on the trip, and we had all kinds of complications. And then we built this system, and we discovered that mistake I was referring to, that we had made a simple shortcut in the algorithm, just reading out by the maximums, quite in opposite to our general philosophy. And therefore, the robot wasn't actually really working stably in a particular direction. And this shows up in the robot because the robot isn't so well calibrated, so it needs continuous sensory input to steer to the target. You know, in reaching, you could think, well, maybe I just need to measure it once and then I can sort of steer there, even though that's not biologically true. So we didn't do an arm. It's much more complex, and I'll hint at that in the second part of this lecture that I might do tomorrow. So we then redid that correctly, and actually the version I'll show you, it doesn't use sound, it uses vision, because sound is actually tricky. I have echo, and it's not very good for object identification. So we did it with vision, a robot that has a camera. I'll show you that in a moment. And the A and B locations were marked by some colored cues. We had very simple color-based vision. And the experimental paradigm that you do with the infants was mimicked by setting the robot in front of these two objects, then moving one close to the robot so it becomes large on its visual array. That would be the cue, and then we imposed the delay. And in fact, when the robot moved, we moved both of these objects close. As you might see, that they are larger now. And that was the cue to the robot, like putting it into the reaching space of the robot. And then the robot was enabled to turn, and then we would repeat that many times. The sensory information just came from this camera. We only need the angle, so one dimension along the camera, and we use the vertical dimension to find out about the size of objects. So we just summed along the vertical to compute the amplitude of a contribution. We filtered the camera image in terms of color space, so only pixels that were in a particular color slot in a hue were counted. And we actually had two spatial filters, one a high resolution filter that was for identifying the targets, and then a very broadly filtered input S2 that picks up whether both of these objects are pushed close. So this was like a boost to the resting levels with two spatial frequencies. Here's an example of that. This is a video. So here on top you see what the robot sees. This illustrates what happens after filtering. This is just some better visualization of that. And here you see the different contributions. The blue is the field, so it's currently below threshold. And there are the two filters of input. I don't remember which one is which. that will vary as we vary the input. And then here at the bottom, you see the dynamics. So this is the turning rate as a function of the heading direction, currently flat because the peak is below 0. When the peak goes above 0, you'll see the sigmoided activity in some other color. So I'll move this a little bit around again. So what happens is that the experimenter here, you see the actual video, Evelina Dineva did this. She moves this object close. That's the specific cue. And as she does that, you see on the right that the input here on the right increases, both of these inputs. And at some point, and then she moves it back. So then actually there's a little bit of more activation here on the right than on the left due to just a slower decay. And then at some point she moves both of these objects close. There you go. And that gives this field a boost. And as you see, at some point, a selection decision occurs. And now they come through 0 here. See, just a little bit earlier through 0, and that's how the selection decision works. And then next moment in time, it's above 0. A peak has formed. You see this little dotted line here, that's the suprathreshold part. And as you see, as this happens, the slope here goes away from 0. There's an attractor now, and the attractor is at some non-zero direction, and that makes the robot move. You see it's just moving, rotating. You see this is rotating a little bit here to the right, right? So that's all that happens, very minimal. So just let, oops. This is the actual experiment. You might hear that music that Evelina was using to keep from falling asleep. So she did actually A not B experiments on the robot. And these are the two locations, A not B, and see here the robot turns. And so she realizes these paradigms. So she did a lot of trials like this and had arranged for this to be easy to do. And you actually see that the procedure she's using here is that one of the locations is closer than the other, the A location, which is actually what happens in a lot of the NRB experiments where you have so-called training trials. So initially, you often leave the lid on the A side closer to the infant. And that actually really matters. As we found out in our modeling, and there's some published work in a connection science paper of 2008 by Evelina Dineva. So she built physically the behavior experiment transferred to the robotic domain. And so she was able to then reproduce with the robots the core results of the NLP experiment. So for instance, the core result is this age delay trade-off. I don't know if all of you know that. Young infants will perseverate after even a short delay. So here's a different amount of delay. And to this axis, you see how much probability to make the mistake, to perseverate. And so young infants as well as young robots will, even at a short delay, go here into this regime where they make the mistake. While older infants will tolerate a longer delay and only start perseverating at longer delays. In the robot, the amount of the age of the robot is modeled by a parameter. In this case, it was just the resting level. It's generally consistent with the spatial position hypothesis, the idea, a parameter that controls how strong interaction is compared to the input. So when interaction is strong, you have an old model. When it's weak, it's a young model. The resting level is a simple way to modulate that, because if you have a low resting level, then it takes a lot of input to engage interaction. So it's weak interaction. If a high resting level, it's the other way around. But there are other parameters you could use, like the excitatory strength and width and so on. So this illustrates that on the robot, we were able to demonstrate this age delay trade-off. We only measured, until threshold. It's a lot of work to do these experiments. So once we were at threshold, at saturation, we didn't keep going. Here's a couple of curves. I'm not going to explain that in detail, but just to boggle your mind, because it was actually amazing. So what we were able to make different measurements on all these data. We had 400 babies from different experiments that we pulled into that. And we had the model, just the simulation model that I discussed in the previous lecture. That's this CN line. And then we had this robotic model, where we used the same parameter values as for the DFT model. And we did all these different trials with the trial structure I discussed earlier. And then we we're able to compute certain statistics like the probability of a first spontaneous error, probability of the second spontaneous error, and certain conditional probabilities like correct responses on B1 and a couple of things like that. And you see that with this one exception, it was a little bit off. We were roughly able to fit. I mean, it wasn't even, with the robotic model, you don't have a chance to do actual parameter fitting. You have to commit to parameters and then do this experiment, which takes a week. And we didn't repeat that for different parameter values. So we have that's what I call a real sensory motor processor count of that behavior. And so it was very useful and interesting to do that because we uncovered issues and properties as we went there. And one of them is this coordinate transform that I pointed to you. No previous model ever pointed to that. The connections models just assume there's a neuron that stands for one lid and a neuron for the other lid. But to realize that it actually takes some invariance construction where you know that this location is the one that I had previous experience with, that is something that becomes very clear when you do this with this robot. And there's a way to talk about that that's really insightful. So here I'll show you these two videos where this here on the left is the young robot model. Do that again, right? The young robot model. So it's running and there's a target for the right color here off to the left that's not visible for this video, but that the robot sees. And we're introducing these obstacles just to make the robot turn. It has the obstacle avoidance that I have to, see here the robot turns because of that obstacle. As it turns, the camera turns away from that object, it loses it from sight, and the robot goes off because the peak decays, and so now it has, in fact, there's no obstacle there. So it just has flat heading direction dynamics, just go straight, whatever it did previously. This would be out of sight, out of mind, right? And that would be the young robot. While the old robot has the sustained peak or somewhat sustained peak. So as it turns around, it turns back because after the obstacle is gone, it still has the peak, so it still has this attraction to the heading. In fact, it does this again for this obstacle, not perfect avoidance. These infrared sensors on this vehicle are also very short-sighted, so it's kind of cheating. But it does turn back, and therefore that's how it reaches. So there you see the old robot is much better at keeping this object in mind. But now you see the interesting story. That's not actually the correct description, because what we actually have is a young robot with a memory trace. Now that's what we use. This was the young robot without memory trace. The young robot with a memory trace, as you see, behaves correctly. It turns back as well. The reason for that is that the memory trace makes it easier to keep the activation at the peak. So once it's built in memory trace, sort of like a local resting level. So it slows down the decay of the peak. It's a question of parameters, if it is really sustained there or if it is just more slowly decaying, but enough here to turn the robot back after it has avoided the obstacle and for it to then ultimately succeed. And so you see actually what the memory trace is good for. You wonder, why are these infants so stupid to go for the habit, right? But habit is actually a form of stabilizing behavior. So what is actually the problem with NLP for these infants is not out of sight, out of mind. It is just the lack of flexibility. They cannot actually, you could say, they always build a memory of the situation in the memory trace, but young infants have only this somewhat inflexible memory trace that is just a low-pass filter, and therefore they will fall into stereotypical behavior, which is very much what you observe across very different phenomena in developmentally young systems. And what the older infants acquire is this ability to switch, because working memory is a much more flexible form of memory, where through interference you can actually build a new memory and delete the old one. And that's what they can't do. So they can't switch so well. So this robot can show this correct behavior only with respect to this target it has quickly acquired, but when it switches to another target, it will initially be hindered by this influence. And so what is evolving is this flexibility. And so why wouldn't it start, this is what I just said, why wouldn't it start right away like that? Well, you might imagine that if you have working memory, you better be sure it's in the right reference frame, that it is really invariant. If it isn't, then that's going to be very not stabilized behavior. And so a hypothesis that we've been since looking at in a lot of work is that the younger nervous systems have less well-aligned reference frames, so that the problem of them being able to abstract from the view and keep the behavioral significance of information invariant is reduced. And that can understand the spatial precision hypothesis is really about that. And so the robotic example brought that out and brought that fully to light. Good. So this is a natural point for me to break.